My name is Evelyn, and I've lived in Washington all my life. I was born in a little wooden house by the water, raised among tall evergreens that seemed to touch the sky, and I thought I would grow old surrounded by love and laughter. You see, family meant everything to me. I gave my best years to raising children, putting hot meals on the table and mending clothes late into the night by the dim glow of a lamp, always believing that when I grew old, those sacrifices would come back to me in the form of warm embraces, gentle visits, and grandchildren running into my arms. But as the years slipped by, I learned that life doesn't always play out the way you imagine. My story begins on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. I had gone into town to pick up a few groceries, moving slower than I used to, leaning on my old cane that clicks against the pavement with each step. I stopped by the bakery first, the one with the glass cases full of sweet rolls and pies, because I thought I'd treat myself to a small apple tart. It reminded me of the ones I used to make for my children when they were small, their hands sticky with sugar as they helped me press the crust into the pan. I smiled at the memory as I carried the little white paper bag, warm in my hands, across the street toward the grocery store. And that's when it happened. I spotted them, two of my grandchildren, walking side by side. They're taller now, teenagers with headphones around their necks and phones in their hands. But I would know their faces anywhere. My heart leapt. Truly it did. It had been months since I had last seen them, months since they, or their parents, made time to visit. I thought, surely this is a blessing. I'll call out, and they'll run to me, and I'll hug them tight, even if just for a moment on the sidewalk. I straightened myself, stood as tall as my aching back would allow, and lifted my hand to wave. "Sweethearts," I called, my voice trembling but hopeful. They looked in my direction. Their eyes passed over me, resting for a moment, then drifting away like I was just another old woman in the crowd. No recognition, no smile, no pause in their step. They just kept walking, laughing between themselves about something on their screens. My hand froze in the air, then fell slowly to my side. I wanted to believe they hadn't seen me, that maybe they were distracted. So I quickened my pace as much as my tired legs would carry me, calling their names again, softer this time, almost pleading. But they never turned. They walked past me like I was a stranger. I stood there on that sidewalk, surrounded by the noise of cars and chatter, but all I could hear was the silence of their absence, the silence of being invisible to the very ones I once held as babies against my chest. I thought of the nights I stayed awake rocking Daniel, my son, their father, when he was sick with fever, of the times I sewed tiny dresses for my granddaughter's dolls, of the Christmas mornings I worked 2 jobs just to make sure there were gifts under the tree. All that love, all that history, and yet in that moment I was no one to them. Just another face they didn't bother to notice. I turned away quickly, blinking back tears before anyone on the street could see, and shuffled into the grocery store with my head down. The tart in my hand no longer felt like a treat. It felt heavy, like a reminder that sweetness can turn bitter if you carry it long enough without sharing it. As I pushed the cart slowly through the aisles, my mind wandered back to when my grandchildren were little. They used to squeal when they saw me coming, arms stretched wide, shouting, "Grandma! Grandma!" They would climb into my lap, tugging at my necklace, asking me to tell them stories about when Daniel was young. Back then, my house was filled with their laughter, my kitchen messy with flour and sticky fingers from baking cookies together. They used to fall asleep on my shoulder during car rides home, and I remember thinking that moments like those were treasures no one could take away from me. But now, as the years have passed and everyone has grown busy, those treasures feel locked away in a chest I can't seem to open. My own son, Daniel, rarely visits anymore, always saying he's too busy with work or his own life. Birthdays are remembered with a short text message instead of a knock on the door, and holidays feel quieter each year. And still, I waited, always forgiving, always hoping for just one more day with the family I love so dearly. I thought the bond of blood was unbreakable. But today, on that street in Washington, I learned it can fray until it's almost invisible. By the time I finished my shopping, my heart felt heavy as a stone. I walked back home slowly, the groceries weighing less than the ache inside me. When I got to my little house, I set the bags down on the counter and sat at the table where once upon a time my family used to gather. I opened the tart and took a small bite, but it tasted like nothing at all. I felt the loneliness settle around me, like a shawl I couldn't take off. And so, here I am telling you this story, because maybe if I speak it out loud, someone will understand. Maybe another grandmother out there has felt the same sting of being forgotten, of being treated like a shadow in the lives of those we once carried into the world. My name is Evelyn, and this is how I realized that sometimes the deepest heartbreak doesn't come from losing strangers. It comes when your own blood walks past you without knowing your face. When I came home that day and sat in my quiet little kitchen, I thought back to how things had changed over the years with Daniel and his family, and it hurt in ways I can hardly explain. You see, when Daniel was a boy, he was my shadow. He would follow me around the house, asking questions about everything I did. If I was cooking, he'd be tugging on my apron, asking if he could stir the pot. If I was hanging laundry, he'd run between the sheets, laughing as the wind caught them. He was a sweet child, always quick with a smile, always looking for comfort in his mama's arms. I used to think that bond would never fade, but children grow up, don't they? And life has a way of pulling them farther and farther from the arms that raised them. I remember the day he brought his future wife, Melissa, to meet me. She was polite, soft-spoken, with shiny hair and kind eyes, and I was glad to see him so happy. They were young, full of dreams, talking about their future, their jobs, and the life they wanted to build. I welcomed her into my home with open arms, cooked her favorite dishes once I learned what she liked, and I prayed that together they would have a good marriage and a happy family. For a while, everything seemed just fine. They lived close enough that I could visit often, and when their first child was born, I felt like my heart had grown twice its size. I remember holding that baby, so tiny and fragile, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, and thinking to myself, this is my reward for all the years I worked and sacrificed. This is the joy I have been waiting for. When their second child came along, my joy only doubled. My house was filled with the patter of little feet, with squeals and giggles, with toys scattered across the living room floor. I was their babysitter, their storyteller, their safe place. I sang lullabies at night when Melissa and Daniel went out for dinner. I kissed scraped knees, and I rocked them to sleep in the same chair I once rocked Daniel in. Those were the happiest years of my later life, and I held on to them like pearls on a string, thinking the laughter of children would always echo through my home. But as the years passed, things began to change. Daniel got busier with work, always chasing after the next promotion, always saying he was too tired to stop by after a long day. Melissa seemed more and more distant, polite but cold, as though she didn't have much room in her life for me. The visits became less frequent. Instead of every weekend, it became once a month, then a few times a year, and before I knew it, the children were no longer running to me with open arms, but sitting on the couch with their tablets, barely looking up when I tried to talk to them. I tried to tell myself it was just the way of the world, that kids these days were different, that technology was stealing their attention. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. They were growing up without me, and I was being pushed to the edges of their lives. I still called Daniel often, leaving messages when he didn't pick up, and when he did answer, the conversations were short, hurried, as if he had one foot out the door before we even started talking. "I'll call you later, Mom," he would say, but later rarely came. Birthdays used to be grand affairs at my house. With balloons and cakes I baked from scratch. Slowly, those celebrations shifted to their own home, where I was sometimes invited, sometimes not, and even when I went, I felt more like a guest than family. One Christmas, I remember bringing gifts for the children, handmade sweaters I had spent weeks knitting, pouring love into every stitch. They opened the boxes with polite thank yous, but I could see the lack of excitement in their eyes compared to the glow they had when they unwrapped shiny gadgets or toys from others. Melissa even pulled me aside and said gently, "Mom, you don't have to go through so much trouble. The kids would rather have gift cards these days." That cut me deeper than I let her see, because I wasn't trying to give them just things, I was trying to give them pieces of myself, pieces they could carry even after I was gone. Slowly, little by little, I became more of a shadow. At family gatherings, I was the one sitting quietly in the corner, smiling when spoken to, but rarely included in the heart of the conversation. The children stopped asking me to tell stories. Daniel stopped leaning on me for advice. Melissa, though respectful, always kept a distance, as if she was drawing a line between her little family and me. And I never argued, never wanted to cause trouble. I just smiled, swallowed my sadness, and told myself that at least they were happy, even if it meant I had to be lonely. But the truth is, it's a kind of loneliness that no one prepares you for. The loneliness of being forgotten by the very people you built your life around. And so when I saw those children walk past me on the street that Sunday, it wasn't just a simple moment. It was the weight of years pressing down on me. Years of being slowly pushed aside. Years of watching love fade into obligation. Years of realizing that no matter how much you give, sometimes it isn't enough to keep yourself from being invisible. I tell you this not to make you pity me, but to share the truth of what it feels like, because I know I'm not the only grandmother to feel this way. I sit in my little house in Washington, listening to the wind rustle the evergreens, and I think about how quickly the world changes, how quickly love can turn into distance, and how a bond you once thought unbreakable can fray until you can hardly see it anymore. My name is Evelyn, and this is the story of how my own family drifted away, little by little, until one day my grandchildren looked right through me as if I was no one at all. When I lay awake at night in my small bedroom, listening to the old clock tick on the wall, my mind often wanders back to when Daniel was little, and I remember the sacrifices I made, the choices I carried like stones in my pockets, always believing they would matter one day. You see, life wasn't easy when Daniel came into the world. His father had already left us by then, choosing another life that didn't include responsibility, and so it was just me and my boy. I worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, sewing at a factory during the day and cleaning offices late at night. I was bone-tired most days, but when I looked into Daniel's brown eyes so full of trust and love, I knew I couldn't let him down. I went without so many things to make sure he didn't. I skipped new shoes so he could have proper ones for school. I counted pennies at the market, sometimes eating just bread and tea for dinner so he could have a full plate. I walked to work in the rain because the bus fare was better spent on a notebook or a toy car he had been asking for. Back then, every decision I made was for him. Every breath I took was tied to the thought of giving him a better future, and I never resented it. Not once. In fact, I wore my sacrifices like a badge of honor because I loved him more than anything. I remember the winters most vividly, the way the cold would creep into our little rented house with its drafty windows. I would tuck Daniel into bed under layers of quilts, shivering myself as I lay beside him just to keep him warm. He would wrap his small arms around my neck and whisper, "Don't worry, Mama. I'll take care of you when I'm big." Those words were my fuel. They kept me going when my hands were raw from scrubbing, when my back ached from bending, when my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I told myself that all this would mean something, that one day he would grow up, remember all I had done, and I would never be alone. I think of the birthdays I scraped together, baking cakes out of simple ingredients, decorating them with whatever I could afford, watching Daniel's face light up as if it were the grandest celebration in the world. I remember the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for his school plays, pricking my fingers but never minding, because the smile on his face when he saw what I had made was worth more than gold. And I remember the tears too, his tears when he was sick, when bullies at school made him feel small, when he cried because he missed having a father. I held him close every time, promising him that I would always be there, that he would never truly be alone as long as he had me. Those promises were my lifeline, the reason I endured everything. But now, as I sit here many years later, I wonder if he remembers. Does he remember the sacrifices, the love, the way I built my entire world around him? Or has life buried those memories under the weight of his own responsibilities, his own family, his own ambitions? I tell myself he must know, deep down, but when weeks go by without a call, when holidays pass without a visit, when his children, my grandchildren, walk past me on the street without a flicker of recognition, it makes me question everything. Sometimes I look at my old hands, the same hands that once braided his hair when he was small, the same hands that clapped the loudest at his school concerts, the same hands that wiped his tears, and I wonder how they became invisible to him. I wonder how all the love and effort I poured into him could fade into the background of his busy life. It hurts in a way that words cannot fully capture. It is not the pain of anger, though. No, I am not angry. I am heartbroken, but not angry, because a mother's love, and now a grandmother's love, has no room for bitterness, only longing. I sit here and I think about that little boy who once promised he would take care of me when he was big, and I whisper to myself, "Daniel, my son, do you remember?" I do not say it to blame him, only to remind myself that once upon a time I was everything to him, and maybe, just maybe, some part of him still carries that truth deep inside. The sacrifices I made were never for recognition, never for repayment. They were born out of love, plain and simple. But when love feels forgotten, when it feels like the past doesn't matter anymore, it carves a hollow place inside you. And that hollow place is what I carry now, heavier than any burden I ever carried when I was young. My name is Evelyn, and this is how I came to realize that the sacrifices of a mother are not always remembered by her children, and the love of a grandmother is not always enough to hold the hearts of her grandchildren close. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of my grandchildren's laughter filling this house, and I hold on to those memories like treasures hidden in the folds of my heart. When Daniel and Melissa first began bringing them to visit, my whole world felt new again, as if I had been given a second chance at the kind of joy that only children can bring. I remember the way little Sarah, my first granddaughter, would run straight into my arms the moment she saw me, her curls bouncing and her tiny hands clutching my dress as though she never wanted to let go. And her brother Jacob, younger by a few years, always had a mischievous sparkle in his eyes, climbing onto the furniture and giggling when I pretended to scold him, though I never could keep a straight face. My house, which had been quiet and still for so long after Daniel grew up, came alive again with their voices. I would bake cookies with them, letting them pour too much sugar into the bowl, watching as flour dusted their little noses. We would sit at the kitchen table, rolling dough into uneven shapes, and though the cookies came out lopsided and sometimes burnt, to them they were perfect, and to me they were priceless. I can still see Jacob sneaking extra chocolate chips into his mouth when he thought I wasn't looking, and Sarah proudly decorating hers with sprinkles until they looked like little rainbows. And oh, the way we played in the garden. I would set out a blanket under the big maple tree, and we'd sip lemonade while making daisy chains. They would bring me handfuls of dandelions, calling them flowers, and I would place them in a jar of water on the windowsill as though they were the most precious bouquet I had ever received. I remember Sarah once placing a tiny flower crown on my head and announcing, "Grandma is the queen of the garden!" How my heart swelled at her words. Those were the days when my house echoed with giggles and footsteps, when sticky fingers left smudges on my furniture, when toys were scattered across the floor, and I never minded the mess. To me, that mess was a sign of life, of love, of family. Evenings were my favorite when the children would climb into my lap, both of them squeezing in even though there was hardly enough room, and I would read them stories until their eyes grew heavy. Sometimes they would ask me to tell them about their daddy when he was a boy. I would tell them about Daniel's adventures, about the time he climbed a tree and couldn't get down until the fireman came, about the night he lost his first tooth and was so excited for the tooth fairy that he barely slept. Their eyes would widen with wonder, and they would giggle at the thought of their daddy being as small as them. Those nights when they fell asleep on my shoulder, their warm breath against my neck, I felt whole again. I felt that all the sacrifices I had made were worth it, that love had come full circle, that I had found my place again as a grandmother. But now, when I sit in the same chair where I once held them, the silence presses down on me like a weight. The toys are long gone, the kitchen table is neat and empty, and the garden sits quiet without the sound of their laughter. Sometimes I still bake cookies, out of habit more than anything, but the batches stay untouched on the counter, growing stale until I wrap them up and give them away to neighbors. I walk past the maple tree in the yard and remember the little crown of flowers Sarah once placed on my head, but now its branches sway only for me, whispering to the wind. The hardest part is knowing that those children I once held so close are growing up without me. Sarah is a young lady now, tall and graceful, and Jacob is nearly a man. They have their own friends, their own worlds, and I am no longer at the center of it. I tell myself it is natural, that children grow and change, but the way they walked past me on that street, without a flicker of recognition, makes me wonder if those years I cherished so deeply are nothing more than forgotten shadows to them. Sometimes I take out old photo albums, flipping through the pages slowly, tracing their little faces with my finger. I see Sarah with chocolate smeared across her cheek, Jacob with frosting on his nose, both of them beaming at the camera in front of the batch of cookies we made together. I see them in costumes I helped sew for Halloween. I see them wrapped in blankets by the fires I read to them, and I see their smiles, their joy, their love for me shining as bright as the sun. And I whisper to myself, "Did you forget, my darlings? Do you remember these days as I do?" The pictures answer with silence, but in my heart, the memories are alive, vivid, and strong. Those were the happiest days of my life, and though the silence of today aches like a wound that never heals, I hold on to them tightly, because they remind me that once I was not invisible. Once I was the center of their world. My name is Evelyn, and this is the story of how my grandchildren once filled my days with joy, only for time to steal it away, leaving me with memories that shine brighter than the reality I live in now. Holidays used to be my favorite time of year, because that was when family always came together, no matter how busy life was. I remember when Daniel was young, I would start preparing weeks in advance, baking pies, making casseroles, and setting the table with the old china that had belonged to my mother. It wasn't about the food or the decorations. It was about seeing the faces of the people I loved gathered around the table, laughing and talking, filling the house with warmth. When Daniel married Melissa and had the children, those traditions became even more precious to me. I wanted my grandchildren to grow up with the same sense of family, the same joy of gathering together, the same love I had carried all my life. And for a while we did. I still remember the first Christmas when Sarah was just a toddler. She sat on my lap the whole night, tugging at the shiny ornaments on the tree, while Jacob, still a baby, slept soundly in his basket by the fire. I remember thinking that my heart couldn't possibly hold more joy. I cooked a feast that year, and Daniel carved the turkey while Melissa set out the dishes. We laughed, we sang carols, and I felt like I had everything I could ever want. But slowly, things began to change, so slowly at first that I almost didn't notice. Daniel and Melissa began hosting more holidays in their own home. At first, I thought it was natural. They had young children, after all, and it was easier for them not to travel. So I gladly went to their house, carrying pies and gifts, happy just to be included. But even there, I started to notice the shift. Melissa had her own way of doing things, her own recipes, her own decorations, and I tried not to step on her toes. I stayed in the background, offering to help but often told, "It's all right, Mom, just sit and relax." It sounded kind, but it made me feel useless, as though I no longer had a role. I would sit in the corner of their living room while everyone bustled about, listening to conversations that seemed to flow around me instead of through me. The children were growing, busy with their new toys, their games, their friends, and they no longer ran to me as they once did. They would nod politely when I spoke, but their eyes were already on something else. One Thanksgiving, I remember standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Daniel and Melissa laugh with their friends around the table, and I felt like I was looking in from the outside, like a guest instead of family. My contributions no longer mattered. My stories were no longer asked for. My presence was no longer the centerpiece, but merely an afterthought. Birthdays, too, began to change. When Sarah turned 10, they threw a big party at a rented hall with balloons and games, but I was seated at a table with the other older relatives, far from the children, and hardly anyone came over to talk to us. I gave Sarah a necklace that had belonged to my mother, something precious, something I thought she would treasure. She smiled politely, said thank you, and placed it aside quickly, her eyes already back on the pile of brightly wrapped gifts from her friends. I told myself she was just a child, that she didn't understand yet, but the truth stung nonetheless. As the years went by, my invitations to gatherings became less certain. Sometimes Daniel would forget to call until the last minute. Sometimes Melissa would send a text instead of a warm invitation. There were even holidays when I sat in my own quiet house, eating a small meal alone, because they had gone to visit Melissa's family out of town. I told myself it was fine, that they had every right to split their time, but deep down I felt the growing emptiness of being left behind. I tried to host again once, setting the table with my best china, baking pies the way I used to, hoping to bring back the magic of old times. But when Daniel arrived with the children, they seemed restless, distracted, eager to leave early. Melissa barely touched the food, politely pushing it around her plate. And when they left after only an hour, my house felt colder than before, as though the very walls knew that family no longer lingered there. The holidays that once filled me with joy became reminders of what I had lost. The laughter, the closeness, the sense of belonging, it had all slipped through my fingers like sand, no matter how tightly I tried to hold on. And so I stopped setting the big table. I stopped buying extra chairs. I stopped baking as much. My holidays grew quieter, my decorations fewer, until sometimes the only sign of the season was a single candle flickering on the windowsill. I still whispered prayers of gratitude, still told myself to be thankful for the years I did have, but I could not deny the ache in my heart. My name is Evelyn, and this is the story of how the holidays that once brought me life slowly became the loneliest days of the year, reminding me that even in a room full of family, you can feel invisible. My days now are quiet, so quiet that sometimes I can hear the clock ticking louder than my own heartbeat. I wake up early, as I always have, but instead of the sound of little feet running through the hallway or Daniel calling out for breakfast, it is only the creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator that greet me. I put the kettle on, pour myself a cup of tea, and sit by the window where the morning light filters in through lace curtains I have had for years. From that window, I can see the street where children sometimes ride their bicycles or neighbors walk their dogs. And I think of how once I used to be the one waving from the porch as Daniel played outside. How once this home was alive with noise and laughter. Now it feels more like a museum of memories than a house, filled with objects that no one else remembers the meaning of. On the shelves are photo albums, their pages worn from my hands turning them over and over, faces smiling back at me from years gone by. Sometimes I take them out and speak to the pictures softly, as though my voice could bridge the gap between then and now, between the little boy who once called me Mom and the man who now sometimes forgets to call at all. My routine is simple. I water the plants in the morning, though some of them have withered, because I forget they need more care than I can give. I fold laundry that is only my own. I cook small meals, never more than enough for one, though I still catch myself reaching for a second plate out of old habit. The television plays often, not because I care for the shows, but because it fills the silence, giving me the illusion of company. I walk slowly through the rooms, dusting and tidying, though there is little mess left behind these days. The chair where Daniel once sat as a child with a book is still by the fireplace, but it has not been touched in years. The walls still hold the framed drawings my grandchildren made when they were small, stick figures and bright colors spelling out, "I love you, Grandma," though the hands that drew them no longer reach for mine when they see me. Every so often I take the bus into town just to see people, just to hear the sound of voices around me. I sit on a bench in the park, watching young families walk past, mothers pushing strollers, children running ahead, fathers carrying balloons or ice creams. And I wonder if they know how fleeting it all is, how quickly those days slip away. I want to tell them to hold their children close, to listen when they speak, to treasure every hug, but of course I do not say anything. I just smile politely if someone looks my way, then lower my eyes again. In the grocery store, I see other women my age shopping with their daughters, laughing as they compare recipes, or with their grandchildren trailing behind, begging for candy. I stand there quietly with my basket of bread and milk, and I tell myself not to envy them, but I do. Not in a bitter way, but in a longing way, wishing I still had that closeness, wishing I still had that bond. There are days when I do not see anyone at all, when the phone does not ring, when the mailbox is empty, when no footsteps pass by my gate. Those are the hardest days, the days when I wonder if anyone remembers I am still here. I keep myself busy with knitting, with puzzles, with old books, but sometimes the silence grows so heavy that I find myself talking out loud just to hear a voice, even if it is only my own. Nights are the loneliest. I sit in my armchair with a blanket over my knees, watching the shadows lengthen across the walls. I listen to the house settling, the wind brushing against the windows, and I think about Daniel and the children. I wonder if Sarah still wears the necklace I gave her, or if it lies forgotten in a drawer. I wonder if Jacob remembers the stories I used to tell him at bedtime. I wonder if they will ever think to come back, to sit with me again, to let me feel like family instead of a stranger. And yet, despite everything, I cannot let go of hope. Every morning, when I open the curtains, I look down the street, half expecting to see Daniel's car pulling up or the children running toward my gate. Every afternoon, I keep an extra cookie in the jar just in case someone stops by. Every evening, I say a prayer for them, whispering their names one by one, asking God to keep them safe, to soften their hearts, to help them remember the love we once shared. People tell me I should not expect too much, that life moves on, that children grow and forget, but a mother's heart does not forget, and a grandmother's love does not fade with time. It stays even when it is not returned, even when it is pushed aside, even when you are walked past like a stranger on the street. My name is Evelyn, and though my days may be quiet and my house may be empty, my heart is still full of love for my family. I am still waiting, still hoping, still believing that one day my grandchildren will look into my eyes again and see not a stranger, but their grandmother. Until then, I will keep my door unlocked, my light on, and my heart open, because love does not give up, even in the face of silence. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the air carries the smell of blooming flowers and the sound of birds singing from the trees. I had been sitting by the window with my knitting, the same way I do most days when I noticed a familiar car slowing down in front of my house. My heart gave a small jump, the kind of jump I had almost forgotten it could make. The car door opened and out stepped Daniel, and then Sarah, and behind them Jacob and little Lily, now taller than I remembered. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw them walking toward my gate. My hands trembled so badly I had to set my knitting aside. I didn't want to move too quickly, afraid that if I did the moment might vanish like a dream. But then I heard the sound of children's voices, real and clear, and I knew it was true they had come. When I opened the door, Jacob looked at me first. For a second, his face was blank, and my heart squeezed with fear that he would look past me again like I was no one. But then something softened in his eyes, and he whispered, "Grandma!" That one word felt like sunlight breaking through a long, cold winter. Lily stepped closer too, shyly at first, but then she smiled and said, "Hi, Grandma," like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt tears roll down my cheeks before I even realized I was crying. I reached out my hands, and they did not pull away. Jacob leaned into my arms, and Lily followed, and suddenly I was holding them both, feeling their warmth, smelling their hair, realizing that the love I had carried in my heart all these years had not been wasted. Daniel and Sarah stood a little apart, and though I could see the guilt in their eyes, I did not speak of the hurt or the years of silence. There was no need. The moment was not for sorrow, but for healing. We sat in my living room, the house that had been so quiet now filled again with laughter and chatter. The children asked me about the pictures on the wall, about the cookies I used to bake, about the stories I once told. I answered each question with joy, as though I had been waiting my whole life for this conversation. Even Daniel, my grown boy, smiled the way he used to when he was little, and for the first time in many years I felt like a mother again. As the afternoon faded into evening, Sarah placed her hand gently on mine and said, "We should have come sooner." I squeezed her hand back and told her it was all right, because the past cannot be undone, but love can always be renewed. Before they left, Jacob looked at me and said, "Grandma, can we come again next week?" My heart nearly burst at those words, because they carried the promise of tomorrow, of more days filled with family instead of loneliness. When the car finally drove away, I stood on the porch watching until it disappeared down the street, the twilight wrapping softly around me. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel like a stranger in my own family. I felt seen, remembered, loved. My name is Evelyn, and though my journey has been marked by silence, longing, and tears, it has also been touched by hope. And now it is touched by joy. I have learned that love may bend and falter, but it does not break. It waits. It endures. And sometimes, when you least expect it, it returns home.